Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today we will be painting an Age of Sigmar Stormcast Eternals Vanquisher, and we'll be doing this in the classic gold and blue scheme. So without further ado, let's get some brushes and get started. So as you can see here, we've got the model built and primed in Wraithbone spray. Now if you are doing the classic gold scheme, you can choose to prime in the Retributor armor spray. However, I haven't done that because I tend to find that painting over the top of the metallic sprays, especially when you've got heavier colours to go over, so like the blues and the silvers for instance, going over the top of that, will take more coats than if you're going over a more natural background like this. So it's entirely up to yourselves as how you want to do it, but I say for my army I have been sticking with the Wraithbone background. So that then leads us to the first paint that we're going into, which is Retributor armor, and this is, as you can probably guess, to pick out all of the gold armor areas. So that is pretty much the majority of the miniature, with the exception of the cloaks, for instance, the sort of feathering coming out of the top of the helmet. And then obviously the sword. So you might find that you'll still want a couple of coats, just sort of going over this, get a nice smooth layer built up, and obviously getting good solid colour. But take your time and work your way around. Obviously if you do get any of this on any of the other colours, this is obviously the stage where this matters the least in this set, because obviously we can soon neaten up and we will most definitely have a pot of trusty Wraithbone on standby, ready for us. But no, take your time and work your way around, and then we can move on to the next step. The armour itself is pretty much the majority of the miniature, with a notable exception to obviously any sort of meshed in areas around the back of the leg here, for instance. That will be black because obviously that's an undergarment. And then obviously in the handle of the sword will also be gold as well. So take your time, work your way around, and so once you've got this done, the model will be really starting to gain that definition and colour. Once you've got all that gold detail blocked in, the next thing we're going to do is move on to any straps onto the model. For this we're going to be using snakebite leather. And you'll want a sort of small brush. I'm using a small layer brush from the Citadel range for this, just to keep a decent amount of control, and we're going to be using this straight from the pot. But so very carefully sort of pick out any straps and belts that the miniature may have, and just coat over that. Obviously if you do make any mistakes at this stage, that is the easiest to tidy up, including if you do get any on the gold where you don't want it. You can just literally hop back over to Retributor armor and neaten up afterwards. So yeah, just take your time, pick out any straps, particularly with this model here. As you can see, they run across the back of the miniature and around the side, and obviously down the cape here as well. Next up we're going to take a little bit of wildwood contrast, and this is just to go over that sheath for the small dagger on the back here. I have already, as you can see, coated in the detailing on the sheath with the gold already. Obviously if you do make any mistakes, you can obviously neaten up afterwards, but obviously do take your time and pick out that detail. The next colour we're going to look at is Black Legion Contrast, and this is for all that sort of cloth areas and the sort of under skin for the armour. So particularly what you're looking for is sort of any breaks in the armour. So for instance here behind the kneecap, there is this sort of section here which I did leave out when painting the gold, but this contrast paint will cover most things, and particularly if you want to go over with a more solid colour. If you would prefer not to use the contrast range, you are more than welcome to go with say like Abaddon Black for instance, but the contrast ones I tend to find just flow just that little bit easier, especially when doing these sort of softer areas, when you just for when you want it to flow just that little bit nicer. It's also worth using this to pick out any of the sort of little strap nodules on the armour. So notably here, sort of around the leg, for instance, there's these little ones here just sitting on the top, and there is also one or two on the arms as well. So there's a couple dangling down from this sort of wrist piece, and there might be some on the other side as well. So just carefully take your time around to pick out any of these sort of little cloth areas. So there's some around the ankle here as well. And once you're happy with that, then we can move on to the next stage. Obviously, if you do catch any of the gold, just as I have there, for instance, just pop back over with Retributor armour and tidy up. Next up, we're going to take some Volupus Pink, and this is for the handles of the weapons. So just carefully coat this into the handles, and this gives a really nice sort of pink leathered set effect without too heavier, obviously, with the base paints and shading afterwards. And it gives a nice sort of highlight to start us off with as well. So just carefully pick out these sort of handle details. Obviously, for this particular miniature, you've got the handle of the main sword, and then also the grip here as well on the sort of dagger on the back. So do take your time. Try obviously not to get any of this over the gold or brown areas that we've already done, and then we can move on to the next step. The next colour we're going to be moving on to now is a bit of Bal Red, again from the contrast range, and this is to pick out the sort of fluffy feathering from the top of the helmet, and this sort of just gives a really nice sort of shading definition right way off the bat, again without having to worry about too many sort of layers coming in there, and then we can add some nice highlights afterwards. So just take your time to work your way around the sort of golden halo as well that this is sort of worked into. Again, obviously, if you do make any mistakes, just keep that pot of Retributor armour handy. The next stage we're going to be looking at now is getting the silver on the sword, and for this we're going to be using Iron Hand Steel, and we're just literally going to coat this all over the blade of the sword. Now you might want a couple of coats of this just to get a really nice defined colour over the top of this Wraithbone spray, but do take your time when you get down towards the hilt, as there is this sort of decorative filament of the holding of the blade, which you'll just want to get the brush very carefully in the middle of. So work your way over that. As I say, a couple of coats, thin coats, sorry, should get that really showing nicely. So it's now time to block in the second biggest colour on the model, and that is the blue cloak around the bottom of the miniature that runs all the way around the back as well. And for this we're going to be using Cantor Blue, and I'd recommend having a small base brush and a small layer brush to handy so you can switch between the two for when you're getting up and close with the other details, particularly on the back here when you're getting close to these straps and the dagger as well. So work your way around this. Now you will more than likely want a couple of coats. For the majority of the ones that I've painted so far, I have most definitely wanted a couple of coats of this on here, but it really is a really nice strong blue, and makes for some great highlights when we get to that later on. So yeah, take your time, work your way around. Try your best not to get this on anything that you don't want it to. So the gold, for instance, and the other details on the back. If you do make any mistakes, obviously do just pop back and neaten up with the relevant colour. But obviously, you know, the more time that you take and the fewer mistakes, the quicker that will eventually be. Now that we've got the majority of those base colours applied, we're going to move on to some shading, and the first one we're going to be looking at is the gold armour on the miniature, and for this we're going to be using Reikland Flesh Shade, and I'm using a small base brush for this just to maintain the control over the course of the miniature, instead of using a larger sort of standard shading brush. And for this we're just going to be coating this all over the gold armour plating of the miniature, and trying not to let it pool too much in any one particular place, but we wanted to get into all those little recessed areas. So do take your time, work your way around. I tend to find sort of going panel by panel is the most sort of crucial, rather than just trying to sort of slap it on over the top of the whole miniature in one go. That way you'll get a much cleaner, more defined shade to the areas that you're looking for, and it overall improve the aesthetic. With that Reikland flesh shade as well, if the model has any of belts or straps, this would make a nice shade for that as well. So we're just going to take our brush and just gently coat this over the top, just to give it that little extra definition. So the next shade we're going to look at is Agrax Earthshade, and this is just for the red plume on top of the helmet, just to give that a bit more definition and ready for some highlights later on. So just gently coat that over and allow that to dry. And then the final shade we're going to look at is Nun Oil, and we're going to use this in a couple of different ways. Firstly, we are going to coat over any sort of metallics that we've already done, so the sword for instance, and if the model has any sort of silver sort of decorative features. This one doesn't really, but I think some of the other ones in the box set do. Once you're happy with any metallic features, we're then going to stick with the Nun Oil, and we're then going to be looking at the blue cloak, and for this I would recommend sticking with a smaller brush if you aren't already. But what we're really going to be looking at here is just any sort of folds and creases in the miniature, so you'll have to forgive me just because of the way I've got my handle on here. I am going to be coming at this from above, but typically you would sort of work down the miniature, but as I say, we're just literally looking for any creases and crevices that are in there, and we just want to lay a small thin layer of Nun Oil just to help give these folds a bit more definition, again for when we come to do some highlighting later on. So with all those shades now dry, we're going to move on to some highlighting, and where we're actually going to start is with a matte white. Now I'm using the matte white from the Army Painter range, however you can use whatever sort of standard white you've got to hand. Now this is actually for the inside of the cloaks. Now depending on the miniature and the style miniature you're looking at, and with regards to how the cloaks are hanging and draping around the model, this one in particular is actually quite a tricky one because the interior of the cloak is quite well hidden, depending on which angle you're looking at it. Now obviously we're looking straight down on the miniature, so you can see that sort of interior part just there. However, obviously in some of the cases, if you're looking at it like that, it wouldn't be quite so prominent. One of the other massive benefits to using a lighter undercoat, as we have here with Wraithbone, is that obviously Wraithbone is incredibly close to white when looking at it against other colours. Now in this case, obviously, because it is a more trickier location to get to, we're going to try and pick out the most obvious and raised areas with the white so that the definition is quite prominent. So for example, with it back here, there is this raised part in here. Now I apologise if this is quite difficult to see, as I am obviously trying to get the brush in there as well as show you on camera, but there's this sort of raised divot which is obviously the reverse of this crease in the back here, and we're going to literally just try and coat that over the top to give a nice sort of white, brighter highlight than the Wraithbone, and you're going to want to take an extraordinary amount of care not to get this on any of the other colours. Now if you do happen to do that, just neaten up with whichever base coat you've managed to catch, and depending on how bad it is, you may want to reapply a small amount of shade, but it is unlikely that you would actually get this anywhere too detrimental. So sticking with that white, we're also going to be looking at the bottoms of the cloak as well. So this will be a little bit easier to get to, but literally just run the brush along the bottom just to catch all of that fabric area there. The next highlight we're going to be looking at is some Evil Sun Scarlet, and this is for the red plume on top of the miniature, and we're just going to be picking out all of the sort of raised sort of hairs and layers to this plume, just to give it a little bit more brightness back after applying that Agrax Earthshade. So do take your time with this, and obviously try not to cover up any of the shading that we've done. A nice small tipped brush is certainly what I would recommend. Next up, we're going to be using a bit of Gothor Brown, and this is for any weapon cases that might be on the miniature. So for in this case, we've got the sheath on the back here, and we're just going to sort of gently highlight round the edges of this where we have already applied the wildwood beforehand, just to give that a little bit of a brighter finish. Next up, we're going to turn our attention to the gold armour, and for this we're going to be using Auric Armour Gold. And this is the first of two highlights onto the armour, and this one we're going to be picking out sort of any large flat areas as well as any sort of quite sort of defined edges, and we're just going to gently sort of layer in little bits here to just make the highest areas shine just that little bit more. So for instance, on this particular arm, as you can see here, I've just got sort of gone over the most sort of prominent curved part, leaving the original Retributor armour and shading in the other areas, and equally then doing a highlight on the edge. Now obviously, being the gold being the main prominent colour to the miniature, this is likely to take some time, but do take your time, just work your way around and pick out any of those areas that you want to stand out just that little bit more for the gold armour, and then we can move on to the next step. Next up, sticking with that gold armour, we're going to move on to some Stormhost Silver, and this is for any really extreme sharp edges that we really want to shine just that little bit brighter. So for example, on the tips of the pauldrons here, just literally just catching the edges to catch the light on there, and maybe just round the top of the chest piece here as well. So use this quite sparingly, less is definitely more. You can also use these on any sort of rivets as well around the armour. There are several, as this will just help make those stand out just that little bit as well. Sticking with that Stormhost Silver, we're going to move on to highlighting up the sword now. And for this we're literally just going to be catching the sort of very raised edges of this. This is a very nice bright highlight over the top of that iron hand steel and non-oil wash. And what we really want to do is just make those edges really pop and stand out when the light hits them. What you can also do, keeping a very thin tip to your brush, is if this, obviously with a lot of these swords they have a nice sort of rivet and a more sort of prominent area in the centre of the blade as the tip curves off, and what you can do is just gently sort of use the side of your brush just to define that tip just a bit more with the highlight, and that will just increase the light intensity as it touches. The next highlight we're going to be moving to is Techless Blue, and this is to pick out all the high ridges of the cloak, and we're just going to literally have a little bit on our brush at a time and just sort of run our brush sort of down the sort of highest edges of the cloak, just sort of picking them out in a nice sort of straight line, as neat as possible, and that way you get a nice sort of highlight over the top in comparison to the darker blue underneath. So work your way around the cloak. Obviously they're all a little bit different in their own way, and then you can add as much of this or as little as you wish, obviously depending on how sort of strong you want the highlights to be, but obviously just take your time, and then we can move on. Next up we're going to take some Lothorn Blue, and this is just for the very tips of the cape and the very sharpest point. So as this is quite a bright colour, we want to use this quite sparingly, so it's really just right at the very bottom of where we've already painted some of that Techless Blue, just to just make some little standing out points on the cape itself. So just work your way around each of those areas and just pop a little dot at the very base of those lines. And then to finish things off on the miniature, we're going to take a little bit of Wartstone Glow Green, and this is just for that very small diamond in the helmet of the miniature. So you'll want to keep a very still hand for this and just gently touch the edge of your brush over the top of that raised area. And there we have a finished Vanquisher for the Stormcast Eternal armies. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please leave a like or a comment below if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.